I've rewritten this opening paragraph about a dozen times. Every time I try to put the words in order, my hands start to shake, and that phantom smell of ozone and wet, rotting fur fills my nose again. I'm sending this in because I need it to be out of my head and onto a screen, somewhere where it feels less like a hallucination and more like the cold, hard fact it was. It happened last November. I needed money and I needed quiet. My uncle has a buddy who owns a swath of private land deep in the North Cascades. We're talking way off the grid, accessible only by a single-lane logging road that turns to mud if you even look at it wrong. The property had an old repurposed fire lookout and a small generator-powered cabin at the base. The deal was simple. Stay there for 3 weeks, keep the generator running, check the perimeter fence for storm damage, and otherwise just exist. For an introvert like me, it sounded like heaven. I drove up in my Forerunner with Kaiser, my 3-year-old German Shepherd. Kaiser was the kind of dog that didn't spook. He'd chased bears off campsites before without hesitating. I figured between the two of us and the Remington 870 I brought for peace of mind, we were untouchable. The drive up took 4 hours from the last town. As we climbed in elevation, the radio signal died a slow, static-filled death until the only sound was the gravel crunching under my tires and the rain drumming a rhythmic beat on the roof. The trees up there, they're different. Douglas firs that are hundreds of feet tall, covered in this thick, hanging moss that looks like old rags. It blocks out the light, so even at noon it feels like twilight. We arrived around 4 p.m., just as the real dark was setting in. I spent the first hour unloading gear, getting the generator humming, and cracking a beer. It was perfect. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. I remember standing on the porch, taking a deep breath and thinking I had finally escaped the noise of the city. But the shift happened fast. It was around 7 p.m. I was in the kitchen heating up some chili when I realized Kaiser was whining. Not his usual feed-me whine, but a low, vibrating sound in his throat. I looked over, and he was pressed against the back door, his hackles, the hair along his spine, standing up so stiff they looked like wire. "What is it, boy?" I asked, walking over. I opened the door to let him out to pee, but he wouldn't move. He actually backed away, putting himself behind my legs. That was the first red flag. Kaiser never backed down. I stepped out onto the porch alone, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating the heavy rain. But then I noticed it. The silence. If you've spent time in the woods, you know nature's never truly quiet. There's always wind in the boughs, the chitter of insects, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small things in the brush. But this was different. This was the Oz effect. It was as if someone had pressed the mute button on the entire world. The wind had died completely. The rain seemed to be falling without making a sound when it hit the mud. The air felt heavy, pressurized, like the moment before a massive thunderclap. I swept the light across the tree line, about 50 yards away. That's when I saw the deer. It was a buck, standing just inside the perimeter of the trees. At first, I felt relief, just a deer. But as I kept the light on it, my brain started sending me warning signals that I couldn't quite interpret. Its neck was too long, unnaturally extended like it had extra vertebrae. And it was standing perfectly, impossibly still. Not the stillness of a frozen animal, but the stillness of a statue. It didn't twitch, its rib cage didn't move to breathe. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to spook it. It didn't flinch, it didn't bolt. Then the smell hit me. The wind shifted slightly, blowing from the trees toward the cabin. It wasn't the musky scent of a deer. It was a sharp, metallic tang, like copper pennies and old discharged batteries, mixed with something underneath that smelled like meat left out in the sun for a week. I was about to step back inside and lock the door when the buck moved. It didn't turn to run. It didn't walk. It jerked forward. Its front legs moved, but the back legs dragged a split second later, disjointed like a bad stop-motion animation or a video game character lagging. It took 2 rigid mechanical steps into the clearing, and then it opened its mouth. Deer bleat, they grunt,
but the sound that came from this thing's throat made my blood turn to ice water. It wasn't an animal noise. It was a perfect digital recording of a dial-up internet connection tone, followed by the static hiss of a radio, loud, screeching, and coming from a biological throat.
I didn't wait to see what that thing would do next. I slammed the door so hard the frame rattled, throwing the deadbolt and shoving a heavy oak chair under the handle for good measure. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the screeching, that digital dial-up static noise, cut off instantly. It didn't fade away, it just ceased, as if someone had pulled the plug on a speaker. For the rest of that night, the silence returned, heavier than before. I spent the next 6 hours sitting on the floor with my back against the kitchen cabinets, the shotgun across my lap. Kaiser was useless. He had crawled under the table and was shivering violently, letting out these tiny, pathetic whimpers that grated on my nerves. This was a dog that had once taken on a defensive stance against a black bear, and now it was reduced to a trembling mess by a deer? It didn't make sense. Rationality is a funny thing. When the sun finally dragged itself up over the tree line the next morning, turning the gray mist into a blinding white fog, I started to gaslight myself. I told myself it was sleep deprivation. I told myself the deer was likely sick. Chronic wasting disease, CWD, causes neurological issues, right? Maybe it had a crushed larynx. Maybe the static was just a wheeze distorted by the wind. I needed to believe that. I needed to believe I wasn't losing my mind on day one. Around noon, armed with the shotgun and a heavy dose of caffeine, I forced myself to go outside to check the spot where the buck had stood. The rain had been steady all night, so I expected the mud to be washed clean. It wasn't. The tracks were there, deep in the sodden earth, but they were wrong. I crouched down, the smell of wet pine attempting to mask that lingering faint odor of copper and spoilage. The impressions started as standard deer hooves, cloven, sharp, but as I followed the trail where it had walked toward the cabin, the tracks changed. The third step wasn't a hoof, it was elongated. The mud was splayed out like the foot had melted and spread upon impact. By the fourth step, the impression looked disturbingly like a long, thin human hand, fingers digging deep into the soil but with the thumb on the wrong side. I stood up too fast, the blood rushing from my head. I looked toward the dense wall of fir trees. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no squirrels, just that oppressive, watching weight. I spent the rest of the day busy work trying to distract myself. I reinforced the perimeter fence, chopped wood, and checked the generator oil. I was trying to make noise, trying to assert dominance over the space. It was around 4 p.m., just as the light was beginning to fail again, that the auditory hallucinations began. I was around the back of the cabin stacking logs. I stopped to wipe sweat from my forehead when I heard it. "Hey, over here!" My head snapped up. It was a voice I knew. It was my brother, Mike. "Mike?" I called, confused. Mike lived in Ohio. He didn't even know exactly where this cabin was. "Yeah, come on, help me out." The voice was coming from the tree line, maybe 30 yards deep in the woods. It sounded cheerful, casual, but as I listened, the hair on my arms stood up. The cadence was too perfect. It was rhythmic. "Yeah, come on, help me out." It repeated the phrase, same pitch, same inflection, same pause between on and help. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, gripping the axe handle until my knuckles turned white. "Yeah, come on, help me out." It was a loop. It wasn't my brother. It was a recording of my brother's voice, played back on high fidelity. And then the voice glitched. "Yeah, come on, help me out. Help me." The voice dropped 3 octaves into a guttural, wet growl before snapping back to the cheerful tone. "Out!" I dropped the axe and backed toward the cabin. "That's not funny," I yelled, my voice cracking. The response from the woods wasn't words. It was a sound that I can only describe as a laugh, but it was mechanical. It sounded like a frantic clicking, like a calm voice trying to imitate the staccato rhythm of laughter without understanding the emotion behind it.
Ha, 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 ha. Too fast, too sharp. I retreated inside, locking everything down again. As I paced the living room, trying to get a grip, I happened to glance out the kitchen window toward the edge of the clearing. It was fully dark now. I had the outside floodlight on. At the very edge of the light's reach, about 7 feet off the ground, 2 eyes reflecting the beam. Animal eyes reflect light because of the tapetum lucidum, usually green, yellow, or white. These eyes were red. Not the red-eye effect from a camera flash, but a deep, self-illuminated crimson. And they weren't blinking. They were just floating there, wide set. Too wide for a deer, too wide for a bear. I grabbed my binoculars and focused them. The eyes belonged to something pale. I saw a flash of skin, smooth, hairless, wet skin the color of a maggot, draped over a face that looked vaguely like a coyote's but flattened. And then the thing winked. Not a blink, a deliberate, mocking wink. The floodlight bulb outside popped with a loud crack and sizzled out, plunging the yard into absolute darkness.
The light popping didn't just leave me in the dark, it left me exposed. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress an hour ago, now felt like a glass display case. With the floodlight dead, the interior lights of the cabin turned the windows into mirrors for me and showcases for whatever was out there. I couldn't see out, but they could see in. I killed the interior lights immediately, plunging the room into pitch blackness. My breath hitched in my throat. I sat there in the dark, clutching the shotgun, listening. The silence was gone. It was replaced by a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of walking, not on leaves or mud, but the distinct, heavy thud creak of footsteps on the wooden wraparound porch. Thump, creak, drag. It sounded like a biped, 2 legs, but the rhythm was off. It was syncopated. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. It circled the cabin slowly. I tracked it with the barrel of my shotgun, spinning in the center of the living room like a compass needle. Kaiser was pressed against my leg, silent now, trembling so hard he was vibrating against my calf. The footsteps stopped right in front of the main door. I held my breath, waiting for the crash, waiting for the door to splinter. Instead, I heard a sound that broke my brain. It was the sound of a zipper. It sounded exactly like the heavy-duty zipper of my own winter coat being pulled up. Zip. Loud, close, right on the other side of the wood. Then the sound of someone clearing their throat. It was my throat clearing. I recognized the pitch. It was the specific sound I make when I'm about to speak. "Hello?" I whispered before I could stop myself. From the other side of the door, a voice replied. It wasn't my brother's voice this time. It was my voice. "Who's there?" the thing outside asked. It was a perfect recording of me asking that very question, but I hadn't asked it yet. "Who's there?" it repeated. "Who's there? Who's there?" The repetition sped up, overlapping until it became a chattering buzz, and then abruptly stopped. I scrambled away from the door, backing into the kitchen. I needed to block the view. I grabbed a roll of duct tape and some old cardboard boxes from the supply closet. Working by the light of a small tactical flashlight held in my mouth, I frantically taped over every window in the main room. I couldn't handle the idea of seeing that pale face pressed against the glass. As I was taping the last window, the one facing the north woods, I made the mistake of looking through the crack in the blinds one last time. The floodlight was out, but the moon had broken through the clouds. The clearing was illuminated in a pale silver wash. I saw the buck again, the knot deer. It was standing in the middle of the clearing, but it wasn't alone. Standing next to it was another buck, identical, same twisted neck, same rigid posture, and next to that one, a third. They were arranged in a perfect triangle facing each other. They weren't moving. They looked like copy-pasted assets in a video game map editor placed too close together. As I watched, all 3 of them simultaneously raised their heads to the sky in perfect unison, not a millisecond of difference.
Their jaws unhinged, literally dropped open far too wide for the bone structure to allow, and they began to scream. But the sound wasn't coming from outside. The sound was coming from the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt. I ripped the radio off my hip and threw it across the room. It hit the wall, but the screaming didn't stop. It was a high-pitched, oscillating frequency that made my teeth ache. Then the screaming cut out. The radio static hissed. And then came the knock. It wasn't a pound. It wasn't an animal scratching. It was 3 distinct, polite raps on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. "Pizza delivery," a voice said from the other side. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 10 years. It was my grandfather's voice. He died in 2012. "Pizza delivery," the thing mimicked again, sounding like a warped cassette tape. "Open up, sport."
Sport. That single word hit me harder than the shotgun recoil would have. My grandfather was the only person who called me that. He had been dead and buried in a plot in Ohio for over a decade. Hearing his voice, raspy, warm, tinged with the phantom scent of pipe tobacco, coming from that thing outside was a violation I can't properly describe. It felt like someone had broken into my mind, rifled through my most cherished memories, and stolen them just to hurt me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I backed away until I hit the kitchen island, sliding down to the floor. "Pizza's getting cold, sport," the voice said again, but this time the tone shifted. The warmth drained out of it, replaced by that flat, metallic monotone. "Pizza's getting cold, cold, cold." The last word wasn't spoken, it was shrieked, a single sharp syllable that sounded like metal grinding on metal. Then, silence again. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. The next 3 hours were a blur of adrenaline and creeping insanity. I moved Kaiser and myself into the bathroom. It was the only room in the cabin with no windows, just 4 solid walls and a locking door. I dragged a mattress in there and sat in the empty bathtub with the dog, the shotgun pointed at the door. This is where things stopped making sense physically. Around 3:30 a.m., I dropped a shotgun shell. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled it while trying to reload. I watched the red plastic casing fall. It hit the porcelain of the tub. It made no sound. I watched it bounce. Silence. I watched it roll to a stop near the drain. Silence. I stared at it, confused. My ears were ringing, but I could hear Kaiser's heavy breathing. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the other room. But the shell? Nothing. Then, exactly 10 seconds later, the sound happened. Clack, rattle, roll. The sound played out in the empty air, perfectly synchronized to the movement I had seen 10 seconds ago. It was like reality was suffering from lag, a latency issue in the server of the universe. I felt a wave of nausea. The smell of ozone seeped under the bathroom door, stronger now, burning my throat. I couldn't take the blind isolation anymore. The bathroom had a small ventilation fan in the ceiling. I stood on the edge of the tub and used a multi-tool to unscrew the cover. If I angled my flashlight just right, I could see out through the vent slats to the side yard of the cabin. I wish I hadn't looked. The rain had stopped, and the moon was bright. The yard was empty of the deer, but the landscape itself was wrong. There was a large Douglas fir tree about 20 feet from the house. As I watched it, the tree shivered. Not the leaves, not the branches. The trunk itself rippled like a muscle flexing under skin. The bark pattern shifted, swirling like oil on water before settling back into place. And then I saw him. Or rather, I saw me. Standing at the base of that shivering tree was a man. He was wearing a red flannel shirt, dark jeans, and holding a shotgun. He was looking at the ground, pacing back and forth. It was me. It was wearing my clothes. It had my build.
I watched in horror as the copy stopped pacing, looked up at the bathroom vent, directly at me, and smiled. But the smile was too wide. It stretched past the cheeks, tearing the skin at the corners of the mouth, revealing too many teeth. The copy opened its mouth, and my own voice, clear as day, drifted through the vent. "Let me in. I forgot my keys." It took a step toward the cabin, but it didn't walk. It slid, the legs moving in a walking motion that didn't match the speed of the ground passing beneath it, like a character hovering slightly above the map. "I forgot my keys," it repeated, drifting closer. Then the power went out. The generator, which had been chugging along faithfully, sputtered and died, plunging us into total, suffocating darkness.
The silence that followed the generator dying wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air in a tomb. In the sudden pitch black of the bathroom, the only light came from the faint, sickly green glow of the tritium sights on my shotgun. Then the sound started. Chug, chug, chug-a-chug. It was the sound of the generator starting up, but it wasn't coming from the shed outside. It was coming from directly above my head on the roof, and it wasn't a machine. It was wet. I could hear the slap of a tongue, the intake of breath between the rhythmic mechanical noises. It was a throat trying to sound like a combustion engine. Glug, glug, glug. Kaiser lost it. He erupted into a frenzy of barking, launching himself at the bathroom door, claws scrabbling on the wood. "Kaiser, heel!" I hissed, grabbing his collar. He was foaming, eyes rolling back, desperate to get out. Above us, the generator stopped. A long, drawn-out sigh filtered down through the roof vent. Then came a sound like a bag of wet cement being dropped onto the shingles. Thump. The impact shook dust from the ceiling. Something heavy was up there. I heard claws, hard, frantic scratching, skittering across the roof tiles toward the front of the cabin. It moved with insectile speed, scuttling over the peak of the roof and down the other side. Crash! The sound of shattering glass from the living room exploded through the cabin. My stomach dropped. The perimeter was breached. I had no choice. If I stayed in the bathroom, I was a rat in a trap. I clicked the safety off the Remington, clamped the flashlight under the barrel with my hand, and kicked the bathroom door open. "Get back!" I screamed at the empty air, swinging the light into the living room. The beam cut through the dust and darkness. The north-facing window, the one I had just taped up, was obliterated. The cardboard and tape were shredded inward. Rain and cold wind swirled into the room, carrying that unbearable stench of ozone and rotting meat. But the room was empty. I swept the light left, then right. The kitchen? Clear. The hallway? Clear. Then I looked up. It was clinging to the ceiling beams in the corner of the room, positioned exactly like a spider. It was the not me. It was still wearing my red flannel and jeans, but the disguise was failing. The limbs were broken at impossible angles to allow it to grip the wood. Its head was rotated a full 180 degrees, looking down at me upside down. The face was mine, but it was melting. The skin looked like wax under a heat lamp, drooping to reveal something gray and wet underneath. The eyes were no longer human. They were those wide, unblinking red orbs I had seen in the woods. It opened its mouth, my mouth, and smiled. The jaw dropped too low, stretching the cheeks until they tore. "I forgot my keys," it gurgled. The voice was a slurry of water and static. I didn't think. I squeezed the trigger. Boom! The 12-gauge roared, the muzzle flash illuminating the room in a strobe of terror. The buckshot hit the thing center mass. It didn't bleed. It exploded into a cloud of dust and gray fluid, like shooting a puffball mushroom. The impact knocked it off the beam. It hit the floor with a wet slap, limbs flailing wildly. I pumped the shotgun. Ch-clack! "Stay down!" I roared. The thing on the floor convulsed. It began to rearrange itself.
The broken limbs snapped back into place with sickening crunches. The red flannel shirt, I realized with horror, wasn't clothing. It was flesh pigmented to look like fabric. I saw the buttons bleed where the pellets had grazed them. It scuttled backward, moving on all fours like a crab, retreating into the shadows behind the wood stove. "Help me! Help me!" it screamed from the darkness. But it wasn't using my voice anymore. It was using Kaiser's bark, translated into human speech. It was a rough, barking sound that formed words. "Roof me! Roof me!" Then, from the broken window, I heard another sound. More footsteps on the porch. Heavy ones. Many of them. The not-me wasn't alone. It had just opened a door for the rest of them.
I didn't wait for the thing behind the wood stove to finish rebuilding itself. The sounds coming from that corner were wet and frantic, like someone stirring a pot of macaroni and cheese with a power drill. "Come on," I yelled, grabbing Kaiser by the scruff of his neck. We scrambled backward down the narrow hallway toward the back bedroom, the only room left with a solid core door. As I moved, I kept the shotgun trained on the darkness of the living room. From the shadows, the not-me shrieked again. It wasn't a word this time. It was the sound of my shotgun blast, perfectly replicated. Boom! Then again, boom! It was using the sound like a weapon, the sonic pressure hitting me even without the buckshot. I slammed the bedroom door and threw the deadbolt. I shoved a heavy dresser in front of it, my boots slipping on the floorboards as I strained against the weight. Kaiser was pacing the small room, his claws clicking a frantic rhythm, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. We were trapped. The cabin was a straight shot. Living room, hall, bedroom. There was no back exit. The only way out was the window, which looked out onto the steep, rocky slope leading up to the fire lookout tower. But the window was the problem. I had taped this one up too, but the duct tape was glowing. Outside, something was pressing a light against the glass. No, not a light. It was bioluminescence. A sickly, pale yellow glow was pressing against the pane, illuminating the fibers of the tape from the outside. Then, the voices started. It wasn't just my grandfather or my brother anymore. It was a chorus. "Open the door, honey," my mother's voice crooned, soft and sweet. "Sir, do you know how fast you were going?" a police officer I'd spoken to 5 years ago asked. "Table for two?" a hostess from a restaurant asked. "I love you," my ex-girlfriend whispered. They were all speaking at once, a cacophony of memories stripped of context and layered over one another. It sounded like scanning through radio stations, but every station was a person I had met, and every voice was coming from just outside the thin wooden walls. Thump! Something heavy hit the side of the house. The entire cabin groaned. Thump! It hit again, harder. Dust rained down from the ceiling rafters. They weren't just mimicking voices, they were testing the structural integrity. They were looking for a soft spot. I crouched in the corner, the shotgun pointed at the window. "They can't get in," I whispered to myself, trying to stabilize my shaking hands. "It's a solid cabin. It's solid." As if in response, the glass in the window didn't shatter, it melted. I watched in disbelief as the center of the window pane began to droop like heated plastic. The duct tape stretched and tore silently. Through the viscous opening hole, a hand reached in. But it wasn't a hand. It was a hoof. A black, polished deer hoof, split down the middle, pushed through the melting glass. But instead of a leg, it was attached to a long, pale, multi-jointed arm that looked like a giant praying mantis, covered in sparse, coarse black hair. The hoof rotated, the two halves spreading apart like fingers. It tapped the dresser I had used to barricade the door. Tap, tap. The sound echoed from the other side of the room, behind me. I spun around, aiming the shotgun at the blank wall. Tap, tap. The sound was coming from inside the wall. "You're not real," I hissed, the panic making my vision tunnel. "You're not real." The voice that answered came from the hoof hand reaching through the window. It spoke with the voice of a GPS navigation system. "Recalculating," it said flatly. "Recalculating route to meet."
The arm shot forward, extending impossibly long, 6-7 feet into the room, and grabbed the lamp on the bedside table. It didn't try to hit me. It just crushed the lamp and grinded the metal and bulb into dust with a sickening crunch, showing off its strength. Then, the door to the bedroom, the one I had barricaded, began to shake. The thing from the living room, the not me, was pounding on it. Bang! 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 "I forgot my keys," it screamed, its voice distorting into that dial-up static screech. I looked at the window, then at the door. We were being squeezed from both sides. "Kaiser, we have to go." I looked at the melting window. The arm was retracting, preparing to strike again. I racked the slide of the shotgun. I didn't shoot the arm. I aimed for the top hinge of the window frame and pulled the trigger. Boom! The wood splintered. I fired again at the bottom hinge. Boom! The entire window frame, weakened, hung loose. "Out! Now!" I grabbed the dresser and heaved to the side, not to block the door, but to clear a path to the window. I grabbed Kaiser's collar and practically threw him through the opening, into the wet night. I scrambled up through it, after him, the jagged glass slicing my jacket. My boots hit the mud with a wet slap. I scrambled up, turning to look back at the hole I'd just crawled out of. The not-me had broken through the bedroom door. It was standing in the window frame, illuminated by the moonlight. It wasn't wearing my face anymore. It had shed the red flannel skin entirely. It was a raw, red musculature figure, standing on 2 legs, but its head was just a smooth, featureless dome of bone. No eyes, no mouth. But from the center of that bone dome, a single sound emitted, loud enough to shake the trees. It was the sound of a baby crying.
I didn't look back at the cabin. The sound of that baby crying, piercing, rhythmic, looping every 4 seconds without a breath, was enough to drive me up the side of the mountain like a possessed man. The terrain behind the cabin was a steep, scree-filled slope leading up to the fire lookout tower. It was maybe 200 yards of incline, but in the dark, with mud sucking at my boots and rain slicking the rocks, it felt like miles. "Go, Kaiser, go!" I wheezed, my chest burning. The dog was ahead of me, a dark shape scrambling over wet logs and shale. We hadn't made it 50 yards when the forest came alive. It wasn't just the thing in the cabin. The woods to my left and right began to rustle with that same heavy, syncopated movement. Crunch, drag, crunch, drag. They were flanking us. "Sir, you dropped your wallet," a voice shouted from the brush to my right. It was a young man's voice, polite, helpful. "Sir, your wallet." To my left, a different voice. "Did you see the game last night? Did you see the game? Did you see the—" It skipped like a broken record, repeating the phrase faster and faster until it blurred into a high-pitched hum. I kept my eyes locked on the silhouette of the tower against the night sky. It was my only chance. The lookout was 40 feet off the ground, accessible only by a steep, zigzagging wooden staircase. If I could get up there and destroy the lower stairs, I'd have a fortress. But the ground itself seemed to be fighting me. Vines that hadn't been there yesterday snagged my ankles. Roots seemed to pulse and writhe under my boots, trying to trip me. I fell hard once, slamming my knee against a granite outcrop. The pain was blinding, white-hot, but the sound of wet, slapping footsteps behind me forced me up. I risked a single glance over my shoulder. The not me, that red, skinless thing, was crawling out of the cabin window, but it wasn't walking. It was moving like a centipede, its limbs moving in a blur, torso low to the ground. And behind it, emerging from the tree line, were the deer. Dozens of them. They stood on their hind legs, pale bellies exposed, their front hooves dangling limply like broken wrists. They weren't running. They were gliding uphill, their hooves barely touching the mud, their heads lolling loosely on those elongated necks. "Keep moving, Kaiser," I screamed as Kaiser scrambled up the last embankment. We hit the base of the tower. The structure groaned in the wind, a skeleton of steel and timber. I gripped the railing of the first flight of stairs and hauled myself up, Kaiser scrambling ahead of me, his nails digging into the wood. We made it to the first landing, about 10 feet up, when the first entity reached the bottom. It was one of the not deer. It slammed into the base of the stairs with the force of a car crash. The entire tower shuddered.
I gripped the railing to keep from being thrown over the side. I looked down, beam trembling. The deer looked up. Its face was gone. In its place was a smooth patch of fur, like the texture had failed to load. But from that blank face came a sound that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. It was the sound of a chainsaw idling. Rum. Then it did something impossible. It didn't use the stairs. It leaped. It launched itself straight up, clearing 10 vertical feet in a single gravity-defying bound. It landed on the outside of the railing right in front of me, gripping the wet wood with those split, hand-like hooves. I stared at it, frozen. The smell of rotting meat washed over me, choking and thick. It leaned in close, its blank, furred face inches from mine. "Recalculating," it whispered. I swung the butt of the shotgun, smashing it into the thing's neck. It felt like hitting a bag of wet sand. The creature didn't recoil in pain, it just lost its grip. It fell backwards silently, tumbling down into the darkness below. "Up, Kaiser, up!" We scrambled up the remaining 3 flights of stairs, lungs screaming, legs burning. I could hear them swarming below, claws on steel, hooves on wood, the chorus of stolen voices rising in a deafening wave. "Pizza delivery! I love you! Help me out! Recalculating!" We reached the catwalk of the lookout. I threw open the heavy door to the cab, shoved Kaiser inside, and slammed it shut, throwing the 3 heavy deadbolts. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. We were 40 feet up. We were safe. Or so I thought. I looked up at the glass windows that surrounded the lookout on all 4 sides. They offered a 360-degree view of the forest. And on the glass, condensation was forming. Words were being written in the steam from the outside. LETUSIN. The writing on the glass wasn't being done by a finger. It was being done by a tongue. I watched, paralyzed as a long, gray, prehensile organ, flat like a tapeworm, slid across the wet glass, forming the letters L-E-T, us, in. I backed into the center of the room near the old Osborne firefinder, the circular map table used to spot smoke. This room was a glass box in the sky. I was on display. The writing stopped. The tongue retracted with a wet slurp. Then the assault shifted tactics. They stopped trying to break in physically. The banging on the stairs ceased. The voices died out. Silence returned. But this time, it was accompanied by a physical sensation. My ears popped. The air pressure in the small room skyrocketed. I felt it in my sinuses, behind my eyes. Kaiser began to whine, pawing at his ears, shaking his head violently. A low hum began. It started at the edge of hearing, a sub-bass frequency that I felt in my chest cavity more than I heard. It was the brown note of fear, vibrating, deep, resonant. The glass panes began to rattle in their frames. The dust on the floor started to dance, forming geometric patterns, cymatics, right before my eyes. "Stop it!" I yelled, covering my ears. It didn't help. The sound was bypassing my eardrums and vibrating my skull directly. Then came the light. From the forest floor below, a beam of light shot up. It wasn't a flashlight, it was a strobe. Flash, dark, flash, dark. It was perfectly timed to the hum. With every flash, I saw them. They were standing on the catwalk, surrounding the glass box. Flash, a deer standing upright, pressing its face against the north window. Dark. Flash, the not me, skinless and raw, pressing its palms against the east window. Dark. Flash, something new, a tall, slender figure made entirely of twisted roots and moss, looming at the south window. Dark. It was a strobe-like nightmare. Every time the light hit, they were in a different pose. Sometimes they were looking at me. Sometimes they were looking at each other. Sometimes they were looking at the sky. I squeezed my eyes shut, huddled under the map table with Kaiser. "It's not real. It's not real," I chanted. "It is real," a voice whispered. It came from right next to me, under the table. My eyes snapped open. Kaiser was looking at me. His mouth wasn't moving, but the voice was coming from him. "It is real, David," the dog said. The voice was deep, cultured, sounding like a radio host from the 1940s. "We have accepted you. Why do you resist the integration?" I scrambled back, hitting my head on the table leg. "No!" I screamed, pointing the shotgun at my own dog. "Get away!" Kaiser tilted his head, that innocent, confused dog expression on his face. He whined, a normal dog whine. "Don't listen to the dog, David," the voice said again, but this time it came from the shotgun in my hands. "The dog is a good boy. The dog is a very good boy." I dropped the gun like it was burning hot. It clattered to the floor. "We just want to show you," the shotgun whispered from the floorboards. "We just want to show you what we found in the dark." I grabbed the only other weapon I had, a heavy flare gun from the emergency kit on the wall. I didn't know if it would work on them, but it was fire. Animals hate fire. "Show me what?" I screamed at the room, at the voices, at the madness. The strobe lights stopped. The humming cut out instantly. The door to the catwalk, the one I had triple locked, clicked. Click. The first deadbolt slid back. Click. The second. Click. The third. They weren't picking the locks. They were manipulating the metal from the outside, turning the tumblers with their minds or some unseen magnetism. Then the handle turned slowly. The door creaked open. Standing there wasn't a monster. It wasn't a deer. It was my grandfather. He looked exactly as I remembered him. Same cardigan, same glasses. He was holding a pipe. He looked solid, warm, real. "David," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "put the flare gun down. It's time to come home. Grandma's waiting dinner." He stepped into the room. He held out his hand. For a second, just a split second, I wanted to take it. The horror of the night, the isolation, the fear, I just wanted it to end. I wanted to go home. "Grandpa?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Yes, Sport, it's me." He took another step. And then I saw it. He wasn't walking. His feet weren't touching the floor. He was floating 2 inches above the wood, and where his shadow should have been cast by the moonlight, there was nothing. He had no shadow.
"You have no shadow," I whispered. The illusion broke instantly. The warm, grandfatherly smile didn't fade. It simply slid off his face like a wet decal. Underneath was a void, a swirling Vanta-black hole where a face should be. The pipe he was holding turned into a jagged piece of bone. The cardigan melted into that familiar raw red musculature. "Shadows are for the tethered," it shrieked. Its voice was no longer my grandfather's. It was the sound of tearing metal. It lunged. I didn't hesitate. I raised the orange plastic flare gun and pulled the trigger. Thwomp! The magnesium flare hit the entity dead center in its chest. It didn't just burn, it sizzled with a blinding white intensity. The creature let out a sound that shattered the remaining windows, a digital scream so loud it felt like an ice pick in my ear canal. The light revealed its true form for a split second, a towering, multi-limbed amalgamation of human and animal parts, stitched together by something that looked like black tar. It thrashed backward, crashing into the Osborne firefinder. The flare, burning at thousands of degrees, ignited the old dry maps instantly. The fire jumped to the curtains, then to the wooden walls. The lookout, a tinderbox of seasoned timber, began to burn. "Kaiser, go!" I grabbed the dog's collar and practically threw us out the door onto the catwalk. The heat inside was already unbearable. The entity was flailing inside the cab, smashing everything, screeching in that dial-up static voice. We hit the stairs. The descent was a blur of vertigo and violence. The fire above us acted as a beacon, illuminating the forest in a flickering, hellish orange glow. And in that light, I saw them.
They were crawling up the tower structure, the knot deer, the pale crawlers. They were swarming like ants on a lollipop stick. As we reached the third landing, a hand shot through the gap in the stairs and grabbed my ankle. It was cold, clammy, and incredibly strong. I looked down to see a face pressed between the steps, a human face but stretched wide, the eyes positioned on the sides of the head like a prey animal. "Stay with us," it hissed. "The fire is warm." I kicked it. I stomped my heavy boot down onto the face. I felt cartilage crunch. The grip loosened, and I scrambled down, sliding more than running. Kaiser was a whirlwind of teeth and fury. A pale, child-sized figure lunged at him from the railing, and he snapped at it, tearing a chunk of gray flesh that dissolved into smoke before it hit the ground. We hit the bottom. The mud was slick, mixed with the ash falling from above. The tower was now fully engulfed, a torch against the night sky. The heat was intense on my back, but it was keeping them at bay. The entities seemed to recoil from the direct flame, chittering and retreating into the shadows of the tree line. "The truck!" I gasped, lungs burning. My forerunner was parked 50 yards away near the cabin. It looked untouched, a monolith of safety in the chaos. We sprinted. Every shadow seemed to reach for us. I could hear the heavy thump drag of the not me pursuing us from the tower, emerging from the inferno, its red flesh smoking but unbothered. I fumbled for my keys as I ran, my fingers numb and slippery with rain and sweat. "Don't drop them! Don't drop them!" We reached the truck. I unlocked it, the chirp of the alarm sounding like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. I threw the back door open for Kaiser. He dove in. I scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door. I hit the lock button. Thud! Something hit the window right next to my head. I looked left. The not me was there. It was pressed against the driver's side window. The flare had burned away half its torso, revealing a rib cage made of what looked like white PVC piping. Its face was a ruin of melted flesh. It raised a hand and tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. "Pizza delivery," it gurgled. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked. Rrr, rrr. It didn't start. The thing outside smiled. It raised a fist, preparing to shatter the window. Come on, I screamed, turning the key again. Rrr, vroom. The engine roared to life. I didn't wait to warm it up. I slammed the gearshift into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the mud, slinging slush, before finding traction. The truck lurched forward. The not me grabbed the door handle, its feet skiing through the mud as it tried to hold on. I swerved hard to the left, clipping the corner of the log shed, the impact jarring the truck, but it dislodged the monster. I watched in the rearview mirror as it tumbled into the mud. We were moving. We were leaving. But as I hit the logging road, my headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated something that made me slam on the brakes. The road didn't look like a road anymore. The trees on either side had bent inward, weaving their branches together to form a solid tunnel. And standing in the middle of that tunnel, blocking the only exit, was the buck, the original one. It stood on its hind legs easily 7 feet tall. Its front hooves were crossed over its chest like a person waiting for a bus. Its eyes were glowing that deep hellish red. It didn't move. It just stood there, daring me to hit it.
I didn't touch the brake. I didn't swerve. In that split second, staring at the abomination blocking the road, I knew that stopping meant death. It wasn't just a deer, it was the warden of this prison, the gatekeeper of the static. If I slowed down, the swarm behind me, the not me, the crawlers, the things in the trees would catch up. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles screamed and floored the accelerator. The engine roared, the RPMs redlining as the heavy SUV surged forward. "Hang on, Kaiser!" The distance closed in a heartbeat. The not deer didn't flinch. It didn't try to dodge. It just stood there on its hind legs, arms crossed, staring into the headlights with those burning red eyes. As the bumper rushed to meet it, I saw its mouth open one last time. It didn't scream. It laughed. A low, distorted digital chuckle. Crunch.
The impact felt like hitting a brick wall. The airbags didn't deploy, thank God, or I would have been blinded, but my head snapped forward, whiplash tearing through my neck. The front of the Forerunner crumbled. Metal shrieked against something that was far harder than bone. The creature didn't fly over the hood, it shattered. It was like driving through a frozen pane of glass. The entity exploded into jagged shards of black geometry and gray fluid. There was no blood, only a thick, tar-like substance that splattered across the windshield, instantly obscuring my vision. I couldn't see. The wipers smeared the black tar, making it worse. "Keep going! Keep going!" I screamed, driving by feel, judging the road by the tree line rushing past the side windows. The truck was limping, the radiator was hissing, steam pouring out from under the hood. The alignment was destroyed. The steering wheel fought me, trying to pull us into the ditch, but I kept the pedal mashed to the floor. For 10 minutes, we careened down that logging road. The forest seemed to lean in, branches whipping the sides of the truck like lashes. The radio, which had been dead since I arrived, suddenly shrieked to life. It wasn't music. It was a high-pitched, screeching tone, the emergency broadcast system sound, but played in reverse. Underneath it, a voice whispered rapidly, too fast to understand, looping over and over. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure popped. We hit a pothole hard enough to rattle my teeth, and the truck skidded onto asphalt. The silence broke. The real world rushed back in. The sound of wind, the hum of tires on pavement, the distant rumble of a jet engine high overhead. The radio static cleared, replaced by a fuzzy country music station. I pulled over. I had to. The engine was smoking, the temperature gauge pinned to H. I fell out of the truck, landing on the wet pavement of the state highway. I retched, dry heaving until my ribs ached. Kaiser jumped out after me, pressing his body against mine, whining softly. I looked back up the logging road. There was nothing there, just a dark, muddy track disappearing into the benign, silent woods. No glowing eyes, no static, just trees. That was 6 months ago. I don't go into the woods anymore. I moved to Seattle, into a 4th-floor apartment in the densest part of the city. I need the noise. I need the sirens, the traffic, the shouting of people. I need to know that the sounds I hear are real. I sold the Forerunner for scrap. The mechanic who looked at it asked me what I hit. He said the damage to the front frame looked like I'd driven into a steel bollard at 50 miles an hour. He also asked about the black gunk caked inside the engine block. He said it smelled like ozone and old blood. I told him to just crush it. Physically, I'm fine. My neck still clicks when I turn it, but the bruise is healed. Kaiser is okay. He's different now. He doesn't like being alone in a room. He sleeps in my bed, under the covers, and growls at empty corners. But the real damage isn't physical. It's the phone calls. Every now and then, I'll get a call from an unknown number. Usually I ignore them, but last week I picked up without thinking. There was no one on the line, just that faint background hiss, that ozone static. And then a voice. It was my own voice, recorded from the night I escaped. "Keep going, keep going," it screamed, tinny and terrified. Then a pause, and a new voice, smooth, mechanical. "We missed you, sport. When are you coming back to finish the game?" I hung up and threw the phone across the room. I know they can't get me here. There's too much iron, too much electricity, too many people. But sometimes, when the city quiets down around 3 a.m. and the rain hits my window, I swear I can hear it. Thump, creak, drag. And I know that somewhere, deep in the North Cascades, in a burned-out shell of a fire tower, something is still wearing my face, waiting for me to come home.